Okay, we're going to get started. Good afternoon, everybody, and apologize for getting a bit of a late start. A little bit of trouble getting some things set up here, but looks like we're ready to go today. I had just sent you the PowerPoint package by email of the file that will sort of correspond to what I'm going to be talking about today and also Wednesday. And I think I actually misspelled. I had trouble finding the file. I think I misspelled the word microeconomics, which is pretty bad. But anyway, I will fix that, but that's in your email to you. And I'm going to be getting into this bit about Chapter 7 today. First thing we're going to do, just to sort of give you a rundown as to where we are, is I'm going to finish up some of the material that we began talking about on Wednesday, dealing with Chapter 6, which dealt with utility, consumer choice, how consumers make choices, how they do it, and based upon their own utility, which is a diminishing function. That is, the more we consume of something, the less satisfaction we get incrementally, whether it's cups of coffee or, glasses of iced tea or whatever, we lose our satisfaction, or it sort of diminishes over time. Plus, if something is less scarce, it becomes less valuable. And we're going to make the case that utility really forms the crux of what demand is all about. Okay, so we're going to do that, and we're going to get into Chapter 7. Now, Chapter 7 is sort of similar to Chapter 5 in the sense that these are probably the only two chapters that I'll say are really important chapters, and they are. And if anything, Chapter 7 may be more important than Chapter 5, which dealt with elasticity. Elasticity is an important chapter because it's just not something people really think about much in their daily lives, and so we have to really go over and do some examples of how that works. But so is the case about Chapter 7 in some respects. And it's going to sort of form the basis, some of the skeletal structure that we'll be filling in as we go in the next several weeks when we talk about the economics of business firms. And so, again, sort of to step back a bit from where we are, sort of based upon the circular flow model of economic actors, we talked some, we'll finish up the discussion about the economics of the household today, here in the next, within the first half hour. And we are going to come back to the household a bit later. I think it's Chapter 14. Which deals with households as suppliers of labor, because here we're talking about them on the demand side, but now we'll be talking about them a bit later on the supply side. We'll talk about the economics of labor markets, and so we'll get into that a bit later in the course. So the economics of the households are things we've talked about up to this point. We're going to sort of switch gears to talk about the economics of business firms for quite some time. Most of what this third segment of the course is going to deal with is going to be the economics of firms, and so your text even gives a pretty good introduction as to what's coming when it talks about market structure. I'm going to sort of defer some of that discussion of market structure for just a bit. What we don't get done this week is this is what my plan for today was, just to sort of introduce some of the concepts, and maybe I won't get all the way through the definitions and the general mathematical relationships. So what I don't, I'll pick up on Wednesday. And my intent was for Wednesday to give some examples of how these things work, how these are interrelated, these issues of cost. And so remember, we're talking about the economics of firms. And so one of the big driving factors when it comes to the management of firms is cost. And so we're going to talk quite a lot about cost beginning today and then also into Wednesday. And if we don't get done on that, we'll pick it up and finish up on Monday. I put a little question mark by Chapter 8 because we're definitely not going to get all the way through Chapter 8 for the second exam. There's absolutely no way. And in fact, I'm not sure how much we'll get into it at all. We'll just have to kind of see. I kind of like to make use of the time available in the classroom, just given the fact that, particularly in the spring semester, where, as we've seen, we can have weather-related incidents and whatnot, and I don't want to fall behind. Plus, there's an activity coming up in March that I'll ask everyone to do, and that will take up some class time as well. I think I'm not quite sure what it is yet. It's a college-wide sort of project, and so I want to kind of make use of the time as best we can. So if we get to Chapter 8, that'll be great. It won't be that in depth. It'll be mostly an introduction to that next segment of the class coming up in the third segment. To wrap up the second segment of the class, so when the segment's being punctuated by exams, I'll review for the second exam on Monday, a week from today. And the exam will be available on Wednesday, same as last time, same format, same 40 multiple choice questions, same time allotted, an hour and a half. If you take it in class, you can take an hour and a half in class, but You may get kind of run out by another group coming in here. I don't think there is one though. This is usually why these Monday, Wednesday afternoon sections, I'm able to post the videos pretty quickly because there's nobody kicking me out like they are other times of the day. So you can do it if you want to do it. Now, everyone last time did it online in the Brightspace system, and if you want to do that, that's perfectly fine. I have no trouble with that. I have no preference. And again, as I had planned last time, we had a snow day, which I guess as far as snow days go, this wasn't much of one because we had an exam scheduled anyway. And I don't know that anybody planned to come in because I didn't hear from anybody saying, hey, I planned to come to take an exam and we were shut down for a snow day. But if you do plan to come in, that's fine. But if you want to take it online, I'll have an open Zoom link available the entire class session on the 2nd. And I think my dates are right here. I'm pretty sure they are. I'll have an open Zoom link available so that if you do have questions, last minute questions, I can go over them. I probably won't record that, mostly because I think that in some cases, these things verge on almost like office hours, and we've been discouraged from recording those and making those available when it's obvious, when it could become obvious who's doing the speaking in the class. We don't have any problem with people participating in class speaking, while I'm doing the regular class presentation, but we've been sort of discouraged from recording those sorts of sessions. So it'll be an open link. And again, I think I'm generally pretty available to everybody. I hope nobody's had the issue that I've not gotten back to them on anything. If I have, and it's a completely false statement, I hope you'll let me know so that I can correct that issue. Okay. Also, for those watching it live, I've got the closed caption live transcription going, so hopefully you can see that. And I don't know whether or not, I think I may have mentioned this, I don't know if I did or not, but this doesn't really come through on the YouTube video, and I don't know if YouTube has a way to enable that. I've never really done it. I need to know how to do that, I think. It's not usually been requested. Usually it doesn't become an imperative for any of us as instructors, unless there's an accommodation through the Disability Resource Center. Nonetheless, I'm a person who likes to see the written word anyway. I'm the kind of guy at home who likes the words at the bottom, even though if I can hear everything just fine. So but if I can figure out a way to do that, I will. Perhaps there's a way that Zoom can capture that, and we can just simply upload that into some sort of Zoom recorded video. I just think YouTube is better because I know that YouTube works very well with mobile devices, and so you can watch these lectures wherever you are, riding on a bus, sitting at work, whatever, that sort of thing. Okay. All right. So questions for me about anything as to where we are and where we are going. Okay, well, let's go ahead and so I'm going to finish up chapter 6 today. Chapter 6 dealt with utility, and what did we say the utility was? We gave a definition for that, and an even broader definition was the idea of benefit. And we say that economic actors, and I won't sort of repeat this here because I've got this in a prior class session. This isn't doing a very good job erasing, is it? But we said that economic actors act in their own. They act in order to create benefits, okay? Whether it's for themselves as private sector actors, business firms and households, or whether it's for the general public interest in the case of government. We say that they're trying to create benefits. And in the case of the benefit which consumers are trying to generate, that is households, in their role as consumers, is utility. That is the benefit or the satisfaction from consuming goods. And we know there's got to be some sort of benefit or satisfaction, or who would consume goods at all, right? So we know that there is a benefit. And again, this even sort of ignores the broader discussion that I've talked about before as to whether or not most of our economy is made up of needs versus wants. And I think there's a lot of evidence that most of what we spend our wages and our resources on are on things that we want, much more than what we need. Realizing, of course, that healthcare is one that becomes much more of a need, particularly as one gets older. And as the cost of healthcare rises, frankly, as a percentage of household income. So it's got to be a very large portion of our economy in terms of total spending. And it goes up and up and up all the time, much faster than the rate of overall inflation. Okay, so we say the utility. And what do we say about utility? We said that utility had this sort of configuration where if we had plotted on the horizontal, on the vertical axis, utils, which are some quantity of satisfaction, it's an undefined unit. And I know it's abstract, and I mentioned this last time. I said we should somewhat get a little bit comfortable with dealing with the idea of abstraction, because it comes up again and again in economics. And I said that, by the way, one big abstract value that we deal with now are things like cryptocurrencies, which are completely abstract, but yet have got a robust market and get a lot of attention, probably more than what I think is necessary, but it doesn't matter what I think. Nonetheless, hypothetical values are around and have been for a long time. So it's the same as utils. I can't tell you what a util is. I can't tell you how many utils you would get from consuming a ham sandwich or versus a steak dinner or whatever, or even would it be the same between you and your best friend or parents or whatever. It's individual, it differs. But one thing that is clear is the fact that they do diminish over time. And so we say that marginal utility looks something like this. It's a diminishing function. It's a diminishing function. And when we talk about a diminishing function, we're saying that over time, incrementally, as we go from 0 to 1 to 1 to 2, whatever, the marginal satisfaction, the incremental benefit that a consumer derives from consuming that particular good goes down. And this has got more implications. I know that sometimes textbooks will present this as being, Jane has 5 snow cones, or, well, maybe snow cones is not a good example, 5 candy bars, and eats one, and then eats the second one, and all that, and whatnot. And that's fine. That's a pretty good, simple illustration, but it isn't just a consumer and a good. It's all goods and all consumers, because the fact that it has to do, once again, with this idea we talked about of scarcity, that if something becomes less scarce, it becomes less valuable. So if, in fact, Jane had 5,000 candy bars at her disposal, and they were essentially free because they were so ubiquitous, then how much value would she get incrementally from each one of those? Particularly since at some point you would say, enough with the candy bars, right? Move on to something else. And so this is where consumer choice comes from, is, do I continue to consume candy bars, or do I switch over to some other good? The example that I gave in class was pizza and concerts. And that was sort of the example I gave. I think your book used movies and something else. I forget. Oh, soda, I think, is what they were talking about. And it's the same thing. It's a diminishing function. And so the question comes about as to why is utility diminishing? There's a slide. It's the third slide in last week's PowerPoint package, which dealt with this idea of why is utility diminishing. Let's spend a little bit of time to go over that, if we could, and talk about why it is. And so anyway, so the first of these definitional items of why is utility diminishing is simply the answer that at some point enough of a good is enough. And then we get tired of the same old thing and we decide we want some new things. And again, I talked about this idea of this pervading pretty much all consumer goods, even those, and one of the examples that I gave was entertainment products, where movies and even songs have to try something new, something different, because if we see the same old thing over and over again, it's no longer that really very interesting. And I think I heard an interesting set of interviews with TV producers in the 70s, and how people were really sort of rebelling against and not really watching a lot of the comedy shows, because they were all the same sort of formulaic thing, really rather stupid jokes, and they just really weren't hitting home and whatnot. And this continued through the 80s, and they really had to try some riskier things. In the 90s, people started watching TV much more again, despite the fact that the internet was rising as a competing medium for attention, which today is very definitely a medium of contention with TV. But the point is, though, that doing the same thing over and over again just simply becomes boring, and people don't attach much value to it, and by the way, aren't willing to pay for it. So as a result, in the entertainment industry, something new, something different, something people haven't seen before, because if it's the same thing, nobody wants to see it. And that's why they have to keep moving on and sort of amping up some of the whatever it is, the special effects or the situations or the language or whatever it is you want to refer to. They have to keep sort of dialing it up, sort of resetting the marginal utility function. As I mentioned to you, I've got a colleague in economics who has always talked about marginal utility being a reset that the supply side is always trying to do, always trying to reset marginal utility, which is why the example that I gave last week was that of Tide detergent. And we'll get to the whole issue of brands a bit later in the third segment of the class. excuse me, the third segment of the class that's coming in, we'll talk much more about brands. But what did I say last time? That the Tide continues to reinvent itself, even though it's a very, very strong brand, the strongest of the detergent brands, but yet they always come out with something new, like wintergreen Tide, or what, maybe I'm making that one up, I don't know, or Tide with fabric softener, just something new, just to sort of appeal and make things a little bit more fresh and interesting for the consumer, so that they don't lose interest and don't get attracted by somebody who's got some other shiny object that they might try to encourage them to try. Okay, all right, then the second issue here is it relates to substitutes in each buyer's available consumption bundle. Now, we talked about a consumption bundle last time, and I don't believe your textbook really got into much of a definition, if at all. I don't really recall. But a consumption bundle is simply defined as a collection of goods that an individual household routinely buys, and buys it just as a matter of course. It doesn't really deviate all that much from it. And what's interesting about this is the study of household economics has really revealed to us that most consumers are creatures of habit, I think is the term I would use. That is, they tend to buy the same kinds of goods again and again and again. They might want more utility, more things that are different, but it's the same. But the good itself, they do want the good. They do want changes in the good. They want the good to interest them and keep them excited and make it worth their while, make them willing to pay up for it, particularly if it's a brand. But they'll still buy the same kind of good, whether it's a movie or whether it's frozen pizza or whatever. They will still buy that good itself. And so all those goods will form a part of their consumption bundle. And that in itself relates to income and preferences and all those things which are drivers of demand itself. And so the last thing we'll do in this particular discussion of chapter 6 is sort of tie this back to demand. So it relates to people's individual consumption bundle and what is available for them to buy. And in particular, this idea of substitutes. And I'll talk about that as well here in just a second, particularly as we talk about the connection between income and substitutes. Okay, which, by the way, were these two other measures of elasticity that we talked about with demand, that income elasticity and cross price elasticity. One issue which had to do with substitutes. Okay, one of those measures which had to do with substitutes. And also, so when we talk about a consumption bundle, we're talking about a steep versus narrow, or a broad versus narrow, and then steep versus flat. So, and I got into this a bit last time, where I said if you have a very steep marginal utility function, it must mean that you've got a fairly broad set of options available to you. And then as a result, you lose interest fairly quickly in whatever the thing is, or you're simply done and you want to move on to something else. And it could be that you consume one good and that's it, no more, you're done. And if you consider the fact that we haven't really brought income into this just too much yet, but we will. If somebody has lots and lots of income, they oftentimes have lots of choices. They travel a lot, they do lots of different things, and they don't tend to stick around a certain place because they're sort of on the move trying to find new experiences. You know, the whole idea of showing up late and popping out early, that sort of thing, making a cameo. It's because of the fact that they've got the income and the broad consumption bundle to allow them to go on to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing. So you kind of get the idea that we've got a very broad consumption bundle. Lots, and it relates to income and interest and preferences and all that, but also the income. You've got a lot of choices, and so as a result, you have a quick fall off, quick drop off of whatever it is that you're seeing, and so as a result, you are moving on to something else. If it's flatter, then you have a fairly narrow consumption bundle. And the example that I gave was kids watching the same movie over and over again, where I don't know if you've got siblings or children of your own who may watch the same thing over and over and over again. I've got a young son who wants to see the same thing on YouTube again and again and again. And then, but even then, he'll kind of lose interest, and he'll be in the Spider-Man for about a month, and then now he's into Batman. So it's all Spider-Man, Spider-Man, Spider-Man. Then it's all Batman, Batman. Sometimes he circles back to Spider-Man, but he's moving on to something else. And so I just see that as just sort of a natural part of the function, but it's a very flat, because he doesn't have a lot of options. He can't borrow my keys and go somewhere. I mean, he's got a limited set of options. And so as a result, this is one example of that. Not only that, but we definitely saw that happen in the countries that were definitely command economies, where people would be routinely asked by outside reporters, how happy are you with your circumstances? Given the fact that they had really very few consumer goods, A lot of times they would go to stores in the old Soviet Union, in North Korea, the People's Republic of China, and a lot of the shelves would be barren of goods and whatnot. And yet people reported that they were relatively satisfied with things. And you could argue, well, it's because of the repressive government. They didn't want to go on record as, being critical of anything at all. That might be a part of it. I have no doubt about that. But also, I think a big part of it too is the fact that if you don't know what you're missing, then you don't know what you're missing, right? So you get the idea that as a result, you are relatively content with what you've got because you're not going to get anything more coming your way. And that's one of the difficulties with command economies that we see is this lack of availability of goods, which really relates to a restriction in consumer choice. And so a very flat consumption bundle is that. And again, in those areas that there are many substitutes, so that sort of keeps the flatness the way it is. Okay. All right. What's the next issue? Scarcity. Well, I talked a bit about scarcity before. And for those goods which are less scarce, then we have a fairly steep marginal utility curve. And that is, if a good is fairly ubiquitous, we're not going to really be willing to pay much money for it. And we're going to have a rapid drop off in that. So think about this. If let's say that you go out for a run and you're running, and it's like, God, I'm really thirsty. And you'll stop at 7-Eleven to get a bottle of water. And you'll probably pay more for it than what you would per unit if you bought 24 at, say, Albertsons, or even a single bottle at Albertsons or Smith's or wherever. But you'll pay, say, I don't know, $3 for a bottle of water. But would you pay $3 for the next bottle of water? I seriously doubt you would, probably. You probably would consume that one and boom, you're done. But because, by the way, at some point you will find access to water unless you're in the middle of nowhere. And the assumption is you're not, because you were able to find that bottle of water. But water is fairly ubiquitous. It's not that scarce. I know that's not what we often hear living here in the desert, but it really is not that scarce, particularly for those of us in Albuquerque. Other parts of the Southwest, it's a little bit of a different story, but it's not that scarce. And so as a result, we're not willing to pay that much for that bottle of water. And it amazes me that some people do, pay lots and lots of money for a bottle of water, when in fact, if you know what bottled water is, it's not much better than tap water, really. In fact, there have been lots of studies of bottled water that have shown that you're paying more per ounce than you are for gasoline, and it's not that much different than actual tap water, particularly in areas where the water is pretty good. The water here is the city water is pretty good. Okay. All right. So it has to do with that issue of scarcity. If the good is more scarce, then it becomes a very flat slope. And that has to do with the fact that there are that many substitutes for it, but it's also fairly not very scarce at all. So there is something in economics, and I can't recall whether or not there's a discussion. There might be a reference in the text to something called the diamond water paradox. And it has to do with this. And so if you think about water, it's got a very steep marginal utility curve. That is the idea that, how much water can you drink at a time anyway? And how much water do you even need? You wouldn't go out and sort of hoard and sort of try to store 50,000 gallons of water just for your own personal needs. Unless you're one of these extreme hoarders like you see on TV, most people wouldn't do that, right? So as a result, you have a fairly steep demand curve. You just wouldn't hold on to water for any particular length of time at all. But something like a diamond, you would. And in fact, the diamond doesn't depreciate in value. You really can't destroy it. I don't think anything can really destroy a diamond. It can be cut by another diamond, but that's about it. It's kind of like kryptonite, isn't it? It's really hard to destroy a diamond. I don't even think a nuclear blast could do it. It would simply keep on surviving. And because it's got the appeal of being very shiny and whatnot, it goes on and on forever. And so as a result, the demand curve the marginal utility curve is very, very flat for diamonds because it gives the same amount of utility over and over again, which it doesn't really diminish. It doesn't wear out. People really don't get that tired of it. And the paradox comes from the idea that we're willing to pay lots and lots for a diamond because of really scarcity issues than we are for water. We're not really willing to pay that much for water. Okay. All right. So questions about any of that? Well, this leads us, I've got a slide here related to consumer choice theory. Well, this is sort of the next sort of place we want to go to, that I've sort of opened the door a bit to this discussion about income and spending one's available dollars. And we got into that a little bit with regard to the budget line and how we would allocate dollars to the two hypothetical goods, pizza and concerts. And yeah, consumer choice theory deals with how we deal with all consumption possibilities, with all the income that we have and what it is that we can do with it. And specifically, we're talking about this idea of the marginal utility per dollar. Marginal utility per dollar is basically this. It's the additional utility that we get from the consumption of spending at $1 more on a good. That's the essential definition. What is the additional satisfaction we get from spending $1 more on a good? You can look at this really as the utility of money in this particular case. How eager am I to part with money in order to get the good or service that I'm attempting to buy? In other words, do I value my money more? Do I value that particular good? And if I value that good, then what am I willing to part in terms of money with it? And we measure things in terms of money simply because it's a good way to measure it. We all know the value of a dollar. We all have a pretty good idea of what our own utilities are, marginal utilities. And so when we talk about the marginal utility, let's just step back a bit here and talk about what marginal utility is first of all. And I'm going to come back to this idea, particularly as we lead off into the chapter 7 discussion about talking about marginals versus averages and whatnot. But we said that, I know I gave a bit of a discussion last time about this. I will sort of circle back to that. But we're talking about marginal anything. We're talking about incremental something. That is, what is the additional amount of utility that I get as we consume more of some output? And we say that we get less and less as measured by this hypothetical unit called utils. And so as a result, what are we really saying here? We're talking about the change in the change in the total utility as measured by utils divided by the change in the quantity that we're consuming. And the quantity here will be an output. Okay. As we get into chapter 7, I'm going to be further defining quantity here as whether it's an input or output, but these are outputs of goods. Okay. So the quantity here is the quantity that is consumed of a particular good. Okay. Well, then how do we measure marginal utility per dollar? Well, it's simply this. It's the ratio of marginal utility to a dollar figure, which is simply the price of the good, right? We would measure that as the price of the good. So marginal utility to price is simply the relationship of the value, the marginal utility that we get in relation to the price of the particular good. Okay. And like the marginal utility curve, it is downward sloping. And so as a result of this, because marginal utility is downward sloping, so is the marginal utility to price ratio. Only now what we're really talking about here is we're not talking about utils so much as we are talking about a dollar figure. It's a marginal utility dollar figure. Okay. You could put utils there because it's really utils that we're measuring, but it's really a utility per dollar, really. Okay. And it's simply taking into account the measurement of that. Okay. So let's go back to our hypothetical example then of the two goods that I first started talking about. That was pizza and concerts. And so here's the thing. We talked a bit about this idea of allocation between the two goods. And you can look back in the video from last time. If you recreated the graph that I drew, I won't spend time doing it because it's a little bit involved. It takes a bit of time to do it. But we said that we had different combinations. And let me see if I could just sort of recreate what I said last time. If I have it available, I don't seem to have it terribly available, but it was different units. And if you consumed all of your income, or if you spent all of your income on concerts, you have nothing left for pizza. And so as a result, you would intersect the concert axis at that point where you would spend all your money on that. Or if you spend all your money on pizza, it would be you'd intersect that axis and you'd have nothing available to spend on concerts. And we said that most people are going to be somewhere in the middle. Well, why are they in the middle? And what we didn't do was really bring back into the picture here this idea of marginal utility. So now what we're sort of trying to do is do this. We talked a bit about spending your income. We talked a bit about utility, marginal utility. Now let's put them both together and talk about marginal utility per dollar. And that is, how do consumers make choices based upon the utility they get from consuming goods? And so if we go back to these two goods, and where we have the marginal utility of pizza, P is pizza, divided by the price of pizza, and we have the marginal utility for concerts divided by the price of concerts, then what are we ending up here? What is the particular relationship that would tell us how much we would consume of pizza versus concerts? And we're going to say this, that the marginal, this ratio, and by the way, this is simply a ratio. This is marginal utility in numbers divided by the price. in dollars. And again, every time, everyone in economics, whenever you have a dollar figure multiplied or divided by or into a number, you're going to end up with a dollar figure. And it's simply going to be that particular ratio, right? Whatever that ratio is. And so as a result, if this ratio is out of whack to the point where there's no equality, where marginal utility to price for pizza is greater than marginal utility to price for concerts, then the solution is to do what? Is to buy more pizzas. To buy more pizzas and fewer concerts. Okay, buy more pizzas and fewer concerts. And the reason why is simply this. If you buy more pizzas, what's going to happen? You're going to have less marginal utility for pizza, so this value is going to fall. If you buy more concerts, the marginal utility, or fewer concerts, the marginal utility for that's going to rise. So as one thing goes down, the other thing goes up, you will reach a point of equality, and that is where the rational consumer will guide his or her decisions. And again, I do want to address the issue that comes up, and I talked a bit about it last Wednesday, was the idea of, well, what are you talking about two goods? I mean, there are more than two goods, or, maybe my consumption bundle may have, I don't know, 120 goods in a bag. I don't really know. And again, even the very definition of consumption bundle might be sort of variable for some, because maybe occasionally you'll buy the pumpkin spice latte in October, right? Where no time in the rest of the year do you do that. Okay, I get that. But nonetheless, we're talking about something which is fairly easily apprehensible as to what is in your consumption bundle. And if it's more than two goods, which it probably is, certainly, then you could do these same kinds of equations all the way across the board, and you could even use computers and all kinds of fancy software in order to arrive at some utility, if you knew what the utility was. And again, that's itself is subjective because it's different. We are all different. Okay. So what about the other condition of inequality here, where so we set up an inequality that we determine the solution for that, where if marginal utility to price for pizza is now less than the marginal utility to price for concerts. So what is the solution here? And the solution here is now to buy fewer pizzas with the same dollar amount, right? We're still talking about the same dollar amount. Buy fewer pizzas and more concerts. Fewer pizzas and more concerts. And the reason why is this: if you buy fewer pizzas, then you're going to slide up along the marginal utility to price curve. And by more concerts, you're going to go down on the marginal utility curve. So one thing going up and one thing going down is going to bring that into equality. And so as a result, what are we really talking about here? We're talking about sort of an optimal solution, and I'll go ahead and put this over here, where the marginal utility to price in relation to pizzas is exactly equal to marginal utility to price for concerts. In this, it would be what we would consider to be the utility maximizing combination. Utility maximizing combination, or sometimes called the optimal combination, the optimal consumption bundle. And I'll come back to that topic here in just a second. This would be the optimal condition. The optimal utility maximizing combination, because if there's an inequality here where we're just simply consuming too little pizza and too many concerts, we need to dial the concerts down, spend more of our money on pizza. The opposite condition here, we're buying too much pizza, we should dial that down and consume more concerts in order that we get to some equality. And this is in fact rational. That is, but it also explains the differential prices of goods, doesn't it? Because we know that the price of concerts was twice the price of pizzas, right? I think that was the same ratio that was used in your book. The two examples that they gave there. It doesn't have to be twice as much. In fact, I didn't realize until after I had sort of prepared mine that it was the same ratio price, that is twice as much. It could be 3 times as much, 20 times as much. It doesn't really matter. The point is, though, why is the price greater for one particular good than it is for another particular good? It's because of the fact it gives us more marginal utility. Why are we willing to pay more money for a concert than we are for pizza? It's because it gives us more marginal utility. Now, if we go to a concert every day of the week for a year, then maybe our marginal utility is so low that the only way to get us to go would be give us a free ticket. And even then, maybe we won't want to go. It is the case where marginal utility, I think I talked about this, could actually become negative. And if marginal utility becomes negative, the marginal, where it's negative, then you're going to have a negative marginal utility to price. you have a negative divided by whatever the positive price is, and it's going to be negative. That is, enough of something is enough. And so as a result, a good which is not particularly scarce is difficult to put a price on, frankly. Okay, so this is the reason why we pay more for certain things, is because it gives us more marginal utility. And this is why, all these goods that are produced, the awareness is definitely on the supply side of what gives people utility for creating for the particular good. And what is that? And you can liken it to an experience. What is that experience like? Are you making it a good experience for buyers? And do buyers want to come back, and do they want to keep buying? Because one of the imperatives, particularly on the supply side, is to keep buyers coming back for more and have a regular stream of that. In fact, that's, you've got a business success going on when you have a regular stream of buyers. And then your biggest question is controlling your cost. And that we'll get into when we talk about chapter 7. But if you can control the demand side, and by the way, when I say control the demand side, it sounds like maybe a bit of a fantasy. But I talked to a marketing professor one time who told me that the definition of marketing is the management of demand. I love that definition because it sort of brings it back to the economic relationship, and that is, its demand is the entire buy side of the market. And if the supply side is trying to manage them, then they're simply trying to control what they do to the extent that they're able to do that. I know that a lot of consumers probably wouldn't like to hear that term, that they're being, or the idea they're being controlled. The very term control probably might be considered problematic. But nonetheless, that's what sellers are really trying to do, is to try to control the transaction. And again, we don't really talk about the price of the good as being something that's negotiable, do we? The price is what the price is. I mean, if you can find it, I know that in big ticket items, we can try to negotiate the price sometimes, but even some other big ticket items, we really don't. There's really no wiggle room. And I know when negotiations happen over the price of something, a lot of times it's over very big things, even like buying other companies. There's always substantial amounts of negotiation going on. But for something like a pizza or a concert, there's no argument. This is the price. If you don't like it, get out of line. Somebody else will buy it. Okay. So controlling that, but keeping people happy is the thing. We don't want this coercive type of behavior. The demand side doesn't want to be coerced. They want to be convinced, and they want to be happy. They want to be made happy with whatever it is that's being given. Okay. All right. So, are there questions about this? Before I got maybe a couple more topics to talk about before we make our way into chapter 7. That is this. It has to do with what we would. If this is a utility maximizing combination, then what in fact is the optimal consumption bundle? And that is for a particular consumer or household, however you want to define the demand unit here. If we have, let's say, N units in the bundle, right? N units in the bundle, then what we're really talking about is this, that the marginal utility to price relationship for good A, equals the marginal utility to price relationship for good B, which equals the marginal utility to price relationship for good C, all the way to N goods, if there are N goods in our consumption bundle, that there's an equality among all of those. And how do we make those decisions? Well, we make the decision based upon where we are with our particular satisfaction, where we are in terms of total quantity that we're consuming at the moment, and where are we with regard to marginal utility? We know it's diminishing, but how quickly is it diminishing versus how slowly is it diminishing, given scarcity and other sorts of considerations. And as a result of this, we're trying to achieve this hypothetical equality. And this explains why we substitute goods for the other, right? We try to swap goods out if in fact we find that one good gives us more satisfaction or benefit, or if the price becomes such that if it's two identical goods that gives them equal marginal utility, maybe it's two brands of mayonnaise or ketchup that to us can't be differentiated, then it's about the price. We'll choose the lower price because why? Because if this goes down, this stays the same across two goods, then we're going to pick the good that's going to give us the highest ratio. In other words, you have a smaller denominator on the good that we do end up buying, meaning we get a bigger ratio here. We're trying to maximize marginal utility to price, but across the entire bundle, we're trying to make a set of of equality is there, whatever that ratio happens to be. And so it tells us why we choose that. Now, if you think, whoa, these two ketchups are not all the same, I would rather pay $1 more for the Heinz than I would for the Hunt's ketchup. So as a result, it's because maybe I individually derive more marginal utility from the Heinz than I do from the Hunt's. I don't really like the Hunt's as well. So as a result, we still stay in a form of equality. Maybe I buy the competing brand if it's really, really less, and I'm willing to take a little bit of less satisfaction. Or my income is constricted or whatever, you get the idea. But we're trying to sort of maintain an equality across all goods. And whether they're inexpensive, expensive, it's that whole idea of trying to make these sort of mental notes. And this is, by the way, a lot of what consumers do, maybe not consciously, in shopping for goods. And I'm not just talking about grocery stores, I'm talking about buying cars, buying insurance, buying all kinds of goods where they're trying to make these sorts of mental combinations. Okay. All right. So any questions about the sort of mental jujitsu that might go on within the demand side of markets? I've got one final topic to talk about here, and that is this. Well, what does this look like to you? This idea of a particular kind of demand curve where you've got margin utility price, or a particular type of curve that slopes downward against a PQ sort of plane here. It looks like a demand curve, doesn't it? And by the way, we might say that particular kinds of goods or particular individuals get different amounts of utility. And so for some, for the very same good, the margin utility price relationship might look like that. For others, it might look like this. For other, for consumers, it might all be sort of different configurations of demand, of margin utility price. But if you put them all together, what you end up with, if you sort of added those up mathematically, those demand functions, because remember, these are functions, right? And they are mathematical relationships. What do you end up here? Well, you end up with a demand curve, right? Well, if you have the dollar figure here, the price there, the downward sloping curve is the demand curve. And so as a result, the demand curve is simply this. It is it's the aggregation of the marginal utility function, right? So a demand curve is mathematical combination of all marginal utility curves. Is a mathematical summation of all marginal utility curves. Okay. For a particular good. So a demand curve for some good is the mathematical summation of all marginal utility price curves for all the good. And again, I want to come back to this idea of what a market, how a market is defined. I know I've talked about this before. The metaphor that we used was that of the Russian doll, which, you know, a market could be as big as that entire Russian doll. It stands 4 feet tall. Or if you could open it up and have a little smaller segment of that, even smaller, open that up, and it's smaller and smaller all the time, to the point where you've got something very, very tiny indeed. That would be this idea of micro marketing, where we try to target a particular demand for a particular good in a particular neighborhood. Even it's that finite. Even some retailers like Home Depot, some of the more sophisticated retailers will try to set a price for a good that sort of matches the marginal utility for the good based upon a particular area in which it's being sold. So it has been the case. And I know when I used to teach in a graduate program, I had some students who were in management at Home Depot who would say, because I think I mentioned to them I was going to buy a table saw or something, and they told me what store to go buy it, because it's a lower income store, lower income neighborhood, and the prices were lower because of the fact that consumers couldn't afford as much. And so they told me to go to a particular store to buy it where it would be cheaper, and in fact, it was cheaper than the stores in which they managed. And I thought that was a pretty startling thing. And I'm aware that there are price differentials, you know, among different stores, but I didn't realize it was that extreme. And it was a pretty good, it wasn't a gigantic discount, but it was less expensive. And so it made sense to do. And so you kind of get the idea that marginal utility to price differs for the same good across, you know, different buying segments. And this is why the demand is really that sort of aggregation of all of those put together. Okay. All right. So questions for me about utility and consumer choice theory and what that's all about. We were working on last week's slides here. And so now what we want to do is we want to sort of to move from the economics of households into the economics of business firms. And again, I mentioned this at the outset. This is going to be where we're going to be living for quite some time, because what this really leads us into is an area of economics. I think I even may have defined this on day one of class. One subset of microeconomics study is that of market structure. And we're going to be studying market structure. And it's based on the idea that not all industries, that is the collection of suppliers serving a particular market, are the same. All these industries do not look the same. So as a result, because of that, all kinds of things differ in terms of pricing, approaching the market in terms of promotion, things like output decisions, all those kinds of things. But before we do all that, though, we want to sort of get into some definitions, right? And I want to come back to this idea of the three numerical values that we tend to deal with in economics. And we're talking about those which can be measured in dollar terms, and that is totals, averages, and marginals. Totals, averages, and marginals. And let's talk just a bit more about what those values are. Even though I went over it a bit last time, let's go over it. So when we talk about totals, what we're really saying is that totals are simply what we call the aggregate values, right? So totals are aggregates. So remember the three kinds of values: totals. Oops, I know these are in your slide package. Totals and averages and marginals. Totals are what we call aggregates. And that is, I simply add up total income for every household in a particular zip code. And that would give me total income for that household, right? Or if I wanted the average income, and again, the only average we're going to be dealing with is the most basic form of average. That's called the arithmetic mean. That is simply taking, and a mean is simply an average. It's really a mathematical term, statistical term, that gives us a simple average. A simple average would be, if we're taking the total income for a zip code, say 87102, right? I think that's where we are here. 87102, all we're doing is simply taking it, every household, adding up their income, we get total income. If we want the average income, we take that total figure divided by the number of households, and we get average income for that household. And that would give us a rough idea of what the average household looks like, or does it? And we'll talk about the problems with averages here in a minute. And then marginals is a little bit more interesting, and that is it's incremental. So it's not a mean value, it's simply an incremental value. This is one that's a little less obvious. I think most of us have, there's no question that we all have been dealing with totals our entire lives, and certainly with averages too, particularly the arithmetic mean, that is the simple total divided by the number of observations, right? Now, there's something called the geometric mean, which we'll come back to a bit later when we talk about a particular kind of measure, where we give different weightings. And that is, if we gave a different weighting of income to a particular household based upon, I don't know, whether or not they have children or not, for whatever reason. Maybe it's some kind of policy dealing with children, I don't know. Then we would assign a higher value to that household, or a lower value, whatever the case might be, depending upon what our preferences are in terms of resolving it. But the simple average is simply taking, in the case of income, total income divided by households. But incrementals or marginals is simply saying, where is it going? And that is, if I take the average income or the total income of all the households in 87102 in 2020, then how does it look in 2021 and 2022? In other words, what are the trends? What are the changes? What are the incremental differences between the years? Or is there a difference between the household sizes in terms of number of households? And the marginals are telling us where things are going. And one of the things that's very important for us in economics to be aware of is a lot of times we're trying to use observations in order to make decisions. And I say this again and again, but it's really important, whether it's macroeconomics or microeconomics, like what we're doing here. There is no point in studying any of this. There's no point in you taking the course if economics were not something that's useful for making decisions. And in the context of microeconomics, we're talking about those particular actors who do make decisions in order to create benefit. So in the case of households, to make decisions to maximize their own particular utility and consumption, or as we'll see later, to try to enhance their wage generating capability, or in the case of a business firm, to maximize profit. And that's really the focus of where we're going in this particular segment, to maximize profit. A business firm would have to know what are the incremental changes of things, because if you know where things are going, it's better. You're better able to make decisions based upon that. That's what the whole process of budgeting is really all about. Is trying to determine, hey, what are things going to be like in the next quarter, next month, whatever. next year so that we can create a budget for that particular thing. Okay, all right. Totals and averages and marginals are the three values, but I want to talk about averages because there is a problem with averages, and I've got an entire laundry list. This is probably more than what you might have seen before, because I think a lot of times we think of averages as being, pretty valuable things to have, and it kind of gives us an idea of what things are like. And averages are used. I mean, they're used all the time. Like, here at CNN, we're trying to oftentimes determine the average age of our students, right? And we're finding over time the average age continues to get older, right? As so a lot of colleges, and it's for all kinds of different reasons. A lot of times people will come back or continue their education or study something additional or whatever. And so we see this as a trend as an average, but there are problems with averages in general. Not so much with our enrollment at CNN, it's not that, but there are problems with averages in general, which gives us a preference for marginals. So let's talk about what these problems with the averages are, and then we'll say why marginals are a little less problematic. Number one, extreme data points or observations skew the values, particularly when you've got a small number of observations. That is, when n equals something like 20, you're going to have an extreme value sort of throw that off wildly. Whereas if n equals 20,000, the extreme value won't make that big of a difference. The example I gave, I think last time, was that of a church, for instance. If a church is trying to budget around the average amount of giving for its members, and say, a lot of churches sort of give a recommended, I don't know that they can really enforce it, but sort of a recommended percentage of one's income that is donated, usually on a weekly basis to the church, say 10%. I think that's sort of the biblical commandment if I remember my days from Catholic school. So 10% of one's income. Well, here's the problem. If you're thinking that every household makes around, I don't know, $35,000, and suddenly you've got a new member, and that new member is Warren Buffett, right? Multi-billionaire. Well, 10% of his income would be enough to buy the entire church and buy 40 more churches. So that would really throw off the value. Now, that maybe sounds like a good problem to have, but it also is a problem because it throws off your averages. And so as a result of that, would you really expect Warren Buffett to make up for everyone else's giving, when in fact giving is part of the point of the whole thing? It throws that value out. It distorts it, right? Any kind of extreme value throws it out. Also, somebody who has zero income, we can probably deal with that easier than somebody that has a gigantic income, because that's sort of almost infinite on the upside, where zero can only go to zero. It can't go to negative income, right? So you kind of get the idea, because extreme values throw things off. So what's the solution to that? Well, the solution oftentimes is to throw out extreme values, which is, by the way, what I do in this class here, only I make it to your benefit. I know some instructors over the years will throw out the highest and lowest exam score, the highest and lowest quiz score, whatever. Well, I throw out the lowest, so that's to your benefit, because that lowest sort of goes away. Those are the 4 intermediate exams. And so because of the fact that, I realize that sometimes you get a particular segment of the class that's a little bit difficult. Maybe your particular work schedule or life schedule was challenging that particular segment of the class. And so maybe it's more fair to get a better representation to throw that out. Throwing out extreme values makes sense, and that's why we do it. I don't throw out your highest, though, because that I don't want anybody to get discouraged. If anybody gets 100 and thinks, oh, the 100 just went away. So I don't want to do that too, but I do try to make it to your benefit based upon this idea of extreme values, maybe not telling the really accurate picture of what's going on. So if in fact Warren Buffett joins your church, which is probably unlikely since he doesn't live here, he would distort the value if you're based upon that particular characteristic. Any kind of extreme value is going to throw things off, right? And so as a result, you have to pay attention to that. By the way, people who are very, very tall, I've got a couple of cousins, one of whom is 6'9", and the other is 6'10". They have lots of trouble finding shoes, for one. Sweaters and winter coats are hard for them to find. And the only place they can really go is big and tall stores, and even then sometimes they don't have those as well. The reason why is because the average consumer is not 6'9" or 6'10". Why would you want to stock inventory of a particular kind that person who may or may not happen to stroll in may not even want it? So as a result, you can't really find shoes for somebody who is that large. And these guys have had a lot of trouble finding apparel. Usually they don't have trouble with basketball shoes. The basketball players tend to be, and both of them were basketball players, but they tend to be bigger in general. But just in terms of like dress shoes and whatnot, it's hard for them, because the average person is not that size. So as a result, they've got to go elsewhere. And that's a problem because they're outliers. Don't tell them that because they're pretty big guys, but they are in fact outliers. And so as a result, this is why it becomes problematic from that particular standpoint, because they're not average. Okay, so extreme values throw off those particular observations. Also, average values may contain no individual data point that is actually a point at all. So if in fact you're trying to track something, whatever it is, and you get values that sort of line up like this, and yet your average value comes out to be somewhere like right here, well, that doesn't even correspond to any single value at all whatsoever. Particularly when they're widely dispersed, it may not end up in any value at all. One of the problems with this is the fact that by looking at this, you may not really arrive at any sort of meaningful thing whatsoever. Particularly when you've got widely dispersed data. What if you have two observations and you're taking total income of consumer A and total income of consumer B? Total income of consumer A is $1 million. Total income of consumer B is $1,000. The average of that is going to be somewhere around what, $500,000? Neither one, $500,000 is not even close to either one of their particular incomes at all, not even close. In fact, there's quite a lot of difference between the two. So as a result, what does the average tell you about that? So in small observations or extreme values are involved, and that's a pretty extreme range, I will grant you, but that doesn't really tell you much at all. And it doesn't give you much of a reading as to what you are actually dealing with, right? The other example that we've used before is that of taking things like household size, where you'll hear on the news that the average household has 1.7 children or whatever, right? Which doesn't make any sense whatsoever, since you can't split a person into percentages. And so so it doesn't. You've got people know what they're saying, but it doesn't really. But what are they saying? What really good is it in order to say that there are 1.7 children? It doesn't make any sense at all. And so that really leads us to the third topic: is it may have no real meaning at all. Maybe nothing is really being represented. So the $500,000 on the average between a guy earning $1 million and the person making $1,000, the $500,000 doesn't tell us anything. Doesn't give us any kind of meaning whatsoever. Okay, and then they're often also difficult to manage, and this is really the key thing here about this, is that they're difficult to manage, and that is the idea that particularly as you get to very, very large values, if what you're trying to do is to try to manage the average whatever, you're going to have difficulty, because the bigger the number of observations become, the difficult it is to sort of move this. And that is the example, and one thing I use, which I think is probably one that hits home to everybody, is something like a grade point average. I've used examples of like a batting average for baseball players, and not everybody is a baseball fan. In fact, not that many people watch baseball anymore, unfortunately, I guess. But so I'll use grade point average. It's probably easier to deal with. And that is, so let's say your first semester, and well, let's just sort of sketch it out and see what we can arrive at. And that is this. So you've got, as we all know, we have an incremental performance, right? So we'll call this, we'll just simply go semester, right? And let's just say you're doing a 4-year program and you've got 8 semesters, right? I realize that's sort of hypothetical anymore. We've got a marginal GPA. That's your semester GPA, and you've got a cumulative GPA, which I think we all know the cumulative GPA goes all the way back to day 1, right? Goes all the way back. And let's say your first semester's GPA is a respectable 3.0, which means your cumulative GPA is a 3.0, right? And let's say that you get a bit of a slump the next time. You get next semester you get a GPA of 2.5. Well, what's that going to do to your cumulative GPA? Well, it's going to bring it down, right? Because now you got 3.3 plus 2.5, and I realize there are credit hours involved, and so it becomes that's more of a geometric. It's a weighting, but let's just say it's 3 credit hours per course. Most of them are. Some are 4 credits, some are 1, some are 2, but it doesn't really matter. But let's say that the midpoint of that is 2.75. So it hasn't gone all the way to 2.5, but it's being dragged down. And let's say that the slope sort of continues. Now you go to 2.0, and so now it's coming down a little bit more here, and more still. Let's say now it goes to 1.50, and it's now we've got some real troubles going on. It's falling, but it's not falling as fast, is it? And let's say that now, okay, I have figured out what I'm doing wrong or differently, and so now I want to sort of break back and I get a 3.2. Well, that's going to bring it up, but it's not going to bring it up that much. It's going to bring it up a little bit. Now I'm on a bigger roll. I get 3.4, and I'm going to keep bringing it up. And it's going to rise, and it's not going to rise that fast. And I get now to semester 7, I get 3.75. I'm going to bring it up to maybe a 2.45. It's moving slower and slower. Even if I get a 4.0 in my last semester, it's going to be a little bit too late to sort of move this too much more. And so I end up with something like that. In other words, the incremental change on a cumulative basis, which is an average, right? GPA, the A's average, isn't going that particularly well, okay? Because of the fact that it's going up, but it's not going up that quickly. And because of the fact you've got more and more in the denominator there, right? More credit hours that you're trying to move it into. Now, what might you say if you're applying for, let's say, law school or a graduate program or whatever, and they say 2.52, we really wanted something higher. But what I would say is this: yes, but look at my last 4 semesters; those are all pretty good. If you were looking for 3.0, well, here's your 3.0. The last 4 semesters, in fact, 5 of 8 were 3.0 or better. It was 3 semesters only, and whatever the situation was, maybe you could explain it that way. Would that be a logical explanation? I think it would. Would it work? It might. It might work. It might definitely work. I know there are some programs that are very severe, like medical school, where it probably doesn't really make that much difference because those kind of scores and the standardized test scores really are very, very critical for that. But this might not be a bad argument. But the problem is, though, that you were sort of on a slump here for 3 semesters. Yeah, picked up the pace, but it's really too late to sort of move that average as high as what in reality, you probably would end up a little higher than 2.5, but you probably wouldn't get above. You might get above. I mean, I'm probably being a little bit harsh here. It'd probably be something a little bit higher, but you get the idea. The point that I want to make is the idea that that it takes a bit of time to sort of move the needle, particularly as these values get big. And what if you had theoretically 30 semesters? Then it doesn't really matter. It's like turning a battleship, right? It's so big that it's just really slow to move. And that's really what part of the issue is here, is that as big as something gets, these averages become very difficult to manage. Okay. And then when we talk about averages, there's a slide that I have in there that talks about some of the more common average values that we deal with in economics. And probably the one that's going to concern us the most are the last 3 down there that deal with production. The consumption as average utility, we're probably not going to deal with. I don't think, in fact, I don't think I had any kind of example dealing with average utility. It's not really something that comes up. I don't really even know how beneficial that would be. But we will talk about average cost, in particular, this idea of average fixed cost and average variable cost. And those formulas are given to you right there. And that leads us then into a discussion of cost, which is an important discussion. And let's get into that in the 10 minutes we've got left here. So I want to come back to something that I talked about before. It goes back a little bit of ways, but not that far. And it's a very, very, very simple model of any kind of production system where you've got inputs, right? Whatever those are. Remember, we categorized inputs in general as those 4 input factors: land, labor, capital, entrepreneurial ability. Your text does the same. I think they wait until they get to this chapter. I kind of prefer to get to it earlier because we keep talking about inputs all the time and factors and all that. So it does come up. So we talk about inputs sort of being corralled in this sort of production process, whatever it is, whether it's a good or a service, right? In the production process, and somehow there's a creation of an output, whether it's a good or whether it's a service. And when we talk about inputs, what are the things that we're talking about here? Well, they include things like labor, they include things like capital, et cetera. And when we talk about outputs, we're talking about things like goods and services. I know that we do use the term goods. to serve as a euphemism for both goods and services. But that's what we're really talking about. From an economic standpoint, what are we really interested in talking about here? This is a fairly simple model. A producer at the level of the firm, right? Because we're now moving to the economics of the firm. The firm is the actor that's critical in harnessing inputs in order to make outputs. And of these, you've got a conjunction really of two of the three actors. You've got households providing labor and the firm itself. So you've got those two actors coming together to provide outputs that both firms and households will consume, and that's really what makes it an economy, isn't it? But here's the thing: so these are basically measured in number terms, units of labor, units of capital. However you want to measure units of labor, whether it's labor hours, what used to be called man hours, but now we sort of call it labor hours. That is, number of hours worked times number of people working per what week, per month, whatever, that sort of thing will be labor hours. Capital, which are physical goods used in the output of goods, whether it's I don't know, machines, computers, telephones, even something like that, involved in doing whatever it is that we're doing in order to create the outputs, which are also measured in terms of units. Okay, when we talk about these labor inputs, well, a lot of times refer to these as the Q sub L, quantity of labor, and capital as Q sub K. We use the German spelling of capital here for K. The reason why is not important, but it's just a historical artifact that we tend to use, and so we tend to refer to those inputs in that quantity. And the goods and services here we refer to as quantity, right? And this is the quantity that goes back to the quantity that we've been talking about all the way back to chapter 3. But we're going to be even more specific and refer to that as TP, or total product. Total product. And that is, of the three kinds of variables, these are totals, these are aggregates. These are all the particular production over whatever the period is and whatever the particular focus is. Of these 20 workers working 40 hours per week for this month, how much total output is being produced in terms of total product, and that is a unit. That's a unit. And these are units as well. These are all units, right? These are all in terms of units as well. So they're expressed in number terms. Total product is a number. So why do we have this particular value of total product, and why does it differ from quantity? Well, mostly it's to differentiate. If we just said quantity, we would have to make sure everyone understood it was quantity of output and not quantity of something else. And so a lot of times when we're differentiating outputs from inputs, we will add some sort of subscript here, particularly if we're differentiating one input from the other. So obviously we've got Q being used in various places, and so we have to be as specific as we can so that people are really getting what we're talking about. Quantity of labor, quantity of capital goods, and then the total product, which are expressed in numbers. Well, here's the thing, we did talk about this before, but when we talk about inputs, what do? That inputs basically create costs. And outputs do what? They create revenues. Okay? And when we talk about costs, these are dollar figures. And revenues are dollar figures. And costs are simply outflows, and revenues are inflows, outflows and inflows. I think we went over that a bit earlier. We talked about this idea of inflows and outflows. So here's the challenge, and that is this: to measure up costs versus revenues. And so we talk about costs, we're talking about TC, which is, oops, let me move this over here. Total cost, TC, which is total costs. Again, these are not averages, these are totals, right? Total costs in dollar terms, right? And total revenues, which are TR, total revenues. Okay? Total costs and total revenues. So all I'm really doing here is sort of introducing these particular values. Then I'll come back to the averages here, and then I'll also get into the marginal of these. But right now, I just sort of want to introduce what these are all about. Okay? All right, well, if we are talking here about the economics of the business firm, and we're saying that this particular actor group is trying to maximize its benefit from doing whatever it's doing, that is production of something, then what is that benefit measured as? And we say it's maximizing profit. And so as a result, profit is the goal. So the number one objective for a business firm is to maximize profit. And profit, we're simply going to refer to using the pi symbol, the Greek pi symbol we've seen before. And I want to make very clear at the very beginning, this does not refer to pi as in 3.14259. It's not that. It's not pi as in circumference over diameter. This is simply the Greek symbol for profit. And by the way, we use Greek symbols all over the place in economics. We've already used the delta symbol for change, and that's used in a lot of the sciences in general. But P here is profit. And by the way, if you take macro, particularly like 3 or 4 level macro, you'll see a different use of pi. But for right now, let's we do it as a shorthand. So we'll talk about profit as being simply this: it's the difference between inflows and outflows, right? So it's inflows minus outflows. And we're talking about inflows and outflows of what? Of dollars. Or those things which can be measured in dollars. And I know that in the accounting world, we can even talk about an inflow as being something like somebody who's promised to pay a debt for you. And so therefore, that would be an inflow of an asset. If somebody's, rather than pay you for something, they would say, well, what if I pay this debt off for you, right? Or we assume some obligation you've got to perform something or to do something or to pay something. But it's an inflow and it's measured in terms of dollars. In all cases, even if it's not a check in the mail, it still is measured in dollar terms and measured in terms that we can be objective about and measure and be very specific. And then this leads us then to the next topic, and that is this. If we're talking about simple accounting, then when we talk about accounting profit, and for those of you who have taken accounting before, then this should be relatively straightforward. We've got total revenue minus total cost. But here, we're going to say the total costs are what we call explicit costs only. And we talked about the difference between kinds of costs before. Explicit costs are accounting costs. That is, they're objective, they're measurable, they're verifiable. They're things that two people can agree on. That if I look at payroll expense for the month of February, that somebody else should be able to look at the very same figure and arrive at more or less the same number. Why? Because they're based upon the same standards. Accounting costs generally are standardized. And I know that internal cost accounting can differ and firms can do some fancy dancing and whatnot with that. But for the most part, costs that are explicit costs are generally recognized as being fairly standardized. And this differs then from economic profit, which is what we're mostly going to focus on here, economic profit, which is the same formula, basically, total revenue minus total costs, but it includes here, the cost figure is explicit plus implicit for opportunity costs. And so as a result of this, you've got a different level of cost. So I'm sorry, that's a little bit low there, but this is economic profit equals the same basic formula, total revenue minus total cost, which is that generic formula for profit. But here, the cost figure is explicit plus implicit costs, which means that we've got another layer of cost. And this is going to be a pretty good place to stop, because what I'll do when we come back on Wednesday is sort of talk about what some examples of economic profit are as opposed to accounting profit. And so we'll pick that up. Are there questions for me about anything that we've talked about for today's class session? Okay, well, this is a good place to stop. So if you do have questions, feel free to get with me. And otherwise, I'll see you all Wednesday.